to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 9th day of February. I am so glad that you were able to join us today. I want to welcome you. I want to thank you for your willingness to continue to support not only the Virtual Center, but the Head On Radio Network itself, and I encourage you to continue to do that. I think by the time we finish today's program, you will begin to realize how terribly significant the voice, the progressive voice that you hear on Head On is necessary. It is absolutely critical, and I'll be addressing this later in the program, but it is absolutely critical that we keep our eyes on what's going on, not only locally, but also coming out of Washington, and and that we make sure that we respond appropriately. And I think that's what we intend to do here at the Virtual Center. That's what the Head On Radio Network is committed to do, and basically Bob Kincaid and his folks have been doing that for years. So please continue as much as you can to keep that progressive voice on the air. I want to thank you for joining us today on this Monday. I do want to announce that we'll be doing repeat programs here at the Virtual Center for the next 5 programs, which would mean beginning tomorrow and then Wednesday, and the next week as well, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. I'll be driving to Florida to visit a friend, a longtime friend. We've been friends for more than 45 years, and I'm concerned about him, and I feel the need to get down there and see him. And my wife, God love her, she's been pushing and said, you got to go down. You got to go down. If anything ever happened to David, you'd never forgive yourself. So I called him and made some arrangements. So I'm going to be driving down beginning tomorrow and spending 4 or 5 days with him. And it's a 2-day trip, so I'll be leaving to return next Tuesday morning, but it'll be Wednesday night next week before I get back to southern West Virginia. So for the next 5 days, and I talked to Bob Kincaid about it, and we'll be doing some repeat programs here at the Virtual Center. And what that will mean is that you won't be able to call in. But on the other hand, if you've not been able to catch all of the programs, then I'm sure Bob will do his best to select what he believes to be some of the most appropriate and relevant and timely ones. And I trust him to do that, and I want to thank you all for joining us and continuing to support us here at the Virtual Center. We would love to hear from you on our phone line, which we have reserved just for the purpose of getting you on the air. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N. If you would like to communicate directly with me via email, I would enjoy hearing from you. I would love to hear from you, and I'll do the best that I can to respond appropriately to your email. My address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. And again, we are here live today, Monday, February 9th, but beginning tomorrow, February 10th, and through our Wednesday program next week, we will be running repeat programs here at the Virtual Center. So I just want to make you aware of that. I know that many of you, follow us on the archives anyway, on your iPods and other ways, and listen later than real-time broadcasts. So for you, this will not be an issue. But for those who do turn in on a regular basis and listen to us live, for the next 2 weeks, beginning after today, through next week will be on a repeat broadcast, which means that phone calls will not be appropriate. I wanted to spend some time, as we often do on Monday, returning to our previous program in order to try to refresh a few memories, not only yours but mine, to be very honest with you. But it just so happens that in response to our program last Wednesday, which, if you recall, we spent the bulk of our time together on the issues surrounding the Annapolis Convention of September 1786, and specifically looking at the letter from Louis Guillaume Otto, the French charge d'affaires in New York, back to France, back to Comte Vergennes, and talked about Otto's response or reaction or official report to the French government on the Annapolis Convention. And we spent the bulk of our time together on that. But after the program ended last Wednesday, I began to recognize, first of all, it was one of those programs that I felt came together pretty good. In other words, I really felt that the major points seemed to come at the appropriate times. Sometimes that's difficult. Sometimes it seems to happen. And this was one that I felt at the end of the program on Wednesday that it was one of those that indeed did seem to happen. I made up my mind in the next few days after last Wednesday's program that I would try to write up something in order to establish what I hope is a permanent record of this particular issue. And with the idea that at some point in time I would submit it for publication, probably to our Charleston Gazette, which is our statewide newspaper here in West Virginia. I have not as yet submitted it because I have another one up there that I submitted about a week ago, and I didn't want them to back up on each other. I know that there's no way any newspaper is going to publish one right after the other from the same person. So I thought that the best thing I could do was let them make a decision on whether to run the first one before I submitted the second one. So I think when I return to from Florida and we get back together again week after next, that will be the time that I'll sit down and forward this particular piece that I wrote on the Annapolis Convention. But I thought that it would be a good way here for today's program, since it's been 5 days since we were together, it would be a good way to kind of touch base and review some of the things we did on Wednesday and then move forward. In addition, there are a couple of things that I have added to this piece that we did not discuss on Wednesday's program, which I believe adds a little bit to the subject. So for the first part of our program today, at least, I want to make you aware that a lot of this will be review. Of course, what that means is we'll be able to kind of skip over it rather quickly. But for those of you who were not able to be with us on Wednesday, or who have not had an opportunity to pick up Wednesday's program on the archive, I'm hoping that I can present this in such a way today that it'll make some sense and that you'll get a feel for what the essence of last Wednesday's program was. I have, and I think this will give you an idea as to where I hope to go here. I have entitled this particular piece, "On the Annapolis Convention, Means, Ends, and America's Founders." And of course, in other words, what I felt that I needed to do was talk about the Annapolis Convention in the context of issues which would make sense to and make the Annapolis Convention story relevant to issues that all of us are confronting today. Just to submit a piece to a local newspaper, to any newspaper, on the Annapolis Convention alone, it seems to me, without any effort to link it to issues and events that all of us are confronting in today's world, it seems to me would be, would not make the submission viable. And so what I wanted to do was basically link it to issues today. So that's basically what I did in the introduction. And the issue of the ongoing debate between ends and means, it seemed to me, was the kind of context that would really put the Annapolis Convention, at least what we did with the Annapolis Convention, into an appropriate perspective. So with that, I basically used the issue of ends and means and the issue of education and the use of primary sources as a way to get into this topic. And so the first part of this, the first couple of paragraphs here, are issues not directly related to the Annapolis Convention, but hopefully set the stage for that particular part of the story. Education's national emphasis today on primary source materials and on research promises problems for teachers because it portends numerous contradictions between what our young will be reading and what their textbooks and state guides want them to know and to believe. Again, to paraphrase that, it seems to me that our teachers are in for a challenge, a problem. Because while there's all of this emphasis on the use of the development of research skills in our schools and the use of primary source materials, and I think as much as anything else, that particular theme is being pushed in the Common Core standards, which have been adopted by so many states, that teachers are bound to run into a problem because their kids, their students, are going to be reading primary source materials. And when students really read some of these primary sources, they are going to be confounded by the contradiction between what they are reading and what their textbooks and state curriculum guides tell them they're supposed to be thinking. There's going to be a contradiction. Because what we know, and we've revisited this many times, is that unfortunately, for the education that most of our young people receive, the focus has long been more on the interpretation of the past than students' real understanding of the past. And my point is, when students begin to read seriously primary source materials, they are going to see the contradiction. They're going to be confused and confounded between what the sources say and what the textbook is telling them that the sources mean. And so that's the introduction that I used to this particular piece. West Virginia is not alone in its determination to shield its young from the unpleasant and unflattering when it comes to the nation's history. Tales are legion of libraries banning books and school boards screening manuscripts, requiring publishers to redact critical information from textbooks, even denying adoptions to those who would paint a less than laudatory picture of the nation's objectives, its behavior, and its leaders. In other words, we know and we have known for a long time, because we've heard all the stories about the way textbooks are selected and the way publishers are required to edit their textbooks in order to take out all the controversial stuff, all the information that doesn't fit the overall game plan of making the nation look good, making its objectives look good, making its founders look good. We know that. Thomas Jefferson's call in Virginia soon after independence for a curriculum in reading instruction that featured American history exclusively for the mandatory 3-year attendance of the state's poor remains alive and well in our 21st century schools. You'll recall in Jefferson's bill for the general diffusion of knowledge that all children are required to attend school for 3 years. For poor children, that's the only formal education they were going to get, which is the 3 years that they were required to attend at no cost to themselves. After 3 years, if they continued, they had to pay for it. Their parents had to pay for it. Jefferson's point was that during the 3 years, while we have everybody in our schools, we ought to teach reading principally based on the United States and on American history. And this is a quote from Jefferson's bill for the general diffusion of knowledge. The first stage of this education, which is the first 3 years, wherein the great mass of the people will receive their instruction, Jefferson wrote, the principal foundations of future order will be laid there. And then I've said, teaching the Annapolis Convention is a case in point. What I'm setting out to do is show that there is an acceptable version of the presentation about the Annapolis Convention that has made it into all of our textbooks. And then there's the story about the Annapolis Convention that we have addressed here at the Virtual Center. And so basically, what I'm pointing out in the context is this is an example of the contradiction in our education system between what the sources tell us and what textbooks tell us, or textbook publishers tell us, or state education officials and state curriculum guides tell us, or what state officials tell us, or what school boards tell us, or what, groups, organized interest groups, oftentimes based principally in the area of religion, tell us that our past is about. So here's where we get into the Annapolis Convention. Generations of Americans, if they learned about the Annapolis Convention at all, were told that it was little more than a milestone, a small one, on the road to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. It was merely a blip on the movement towards the adoption of the Constitution of the United States. This is what our textbooks have been telling us all along. If the event is worth remembering at all, we learned, it's because of the yeoman efforts of Alexander Hamilton. Unable to address the business of commercial reform because only 5 states were represented at Annapolis, Hamilton was able to wrest victory from the jaws of defeat by persuading his colleagues to endorse the report's call for another convention the next May, this one to address all matters related to the exigencies of the Union. You'll remember the story from last Wednesday's program here in the Virtual Center. Hamilton wrote the official report for the Annapolis Convention. And in that report, he adopted the language of Abraham Clark's instructions given to New Jersey delegates by the state legislature of New Jersey. And in those instructions, New Jersey's delegates were given the charge, the same charge as all the other 4 states that attended the Annapolis Convention, namely to engage in discussions about commercial reform. But New Jersey was different in that New Jersey also added that its delegates were permitted to discuss all other matters related to the exigencies of the Union. And in the call for the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Hamilton extracted those instructions and included them almost verbatim in the official report of the convention. Our textbooks agree that had it not been for Hamilton, the results would have been catastrophic for the nation's future. End of story. That's it as far as the treatment of the Annapolis Convention in our textbooks throughout the years. That's been the story. But wait, and here's the issue that we addressed last Wednesday here at the Virtual Center. But wait, why did even Maryland, the host state, refuse to appoint delegates? Why did 3 other states, South Carolina, Connecticut, and Georgia, do likewise? More significantly, why did delegates from 4 states that did appoint delegates, North Carolina, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, not arrive in time for a convention when that convention had been called 18 months earlier? In other words, there's too many questions left about the circumstances surrounding the poor turnout at the Annapolis Convention. Then we get into Otto's letter. In a significant letter from Louis-Guillaume Otto, French charge d'affaires to the United States, to Comte de Vergennes, October 10th, 1786, we learn the answers to these and other questions. More importantly, we learn that those most responsible for the call to the convention to Annapolis, from the call to Annapolis, James Madison, Tench Coxe, Hamilton, and John Dickinson, did not want the gathering at Annapolis to succeed. If the convention was able to reach agreement on commercial reform between the states, then all hope for a follow-up convention to take up serious revision of the Articles of Confederation would dissipate. All momentum for substantive political reform, the strengthening of the Union by shifting power from the states to the central government, would be lost. Commerce, Otto reported to Vergennes, was but a pretext for the reformers to introduce other, more serious changes to the nation's overall structure. Hamilton seized upon New Jersey's instructions, which granted its representatives authority to consider other important matters besides commerce, that would allow Congress, quote, effectually to provide for the exigencies of the Union, unquote. This hidden agenda, clearly the reason why Maryland and other states chose to boycott the convention, was rendered intentionally obscure in Hamilton's report. In other words, the way Hamilton's report is written, it would be very difficult to figure out or to see the real agenda here, which was reforming the Articles of Confederation. Otto says in his letter to Vergennes, quote, "The people will see through it only with difficulty. But," he says, "the powerful and enlightened citizens will understand it perfectly." Otto then elaborated on this accusation of obfuscation and deception. And this is a quote directly from the Otto letter. In this document, the commissioners make use of an infinity of circumlocutions and ambiguous phrases to explain to their constituents the impossibility of taking into consideration a general plan of commerce. In spite of the obscurity of this document, you will perceive, my lord, that the commissioners do not wish to take into consideration the grievances of commerce without perfecting at the same time the fundamental constitution of Congress, unquote. Otto goes on to tell us that the delegates who never made it to Annapolis, quote, were held up for several days in New York in order to delay their arrival, unquote. And that the spokesman for the convention did not want the convention to succeed. Instead, they sought its failure. Only then would they have any chance of securing the real prize that they thought, which was constitutional reform of the Union. Now I'm basically asking questions about this behavior of Hamilton, Madison, and the others. Duplicitous, unscrupulous, elitist in their attitudes toward the citizenry, dishonest, manipulative, fraudulent. You remember, if you were with us on Wednesday, that Bob Kincaid called, and he's the one that introduced the word fraud. He called this behavior fraudulent. Just where do we draw the line? Delegates intentionally delayed, thereby making sure the convention cannot do business? Wow. How do teachers, committed teachers, proceed once they know these facts? Is there a way to do justice to the founders, to the past, to the discipline itself, that will not lead to teachers losing either their jobs or their professionalism? One thing we know for sure: student interest is heightened when real learning is happening. Perhaps the age-old debate between ends and means offers us an answer. The controversy over ends and means has a long history, especially on whether the first legitimizes the second. All through our lives, and this is, I'm kind of out of the quote here, out of the letter here, I'm just trying to elaborate or explain. All through our history, we've heard the debate, the argument between ends and means, and people saying, do the means justify the ends? Or rather, do the ends justify the means? And it becomes very confusing to a lot of people we know. Einstein said that this controversy defined the age. In other words, this is so frequent a discussion, Einstein says, that really, in a sense, it defines the whole age we live in. Immanuel Kant introduced morality into the debate, asserting that what he called a categorical imperative, that man must always be the end, never the means to an end. For those of you, and I know that there aren't all that many because Kant is difficult, but those who are familiar with Immanuel Kant will know that he is associated with the idea of what he calls the categorical imperative. And the categorical imperative is that in the debate between ends and means, man must always be the end, never the means. Because Kant is arguing the issues of morality here. Because man is man. That means, according to him, that you should not use man as means to some other end. That man must always be the means. Everything you do must be oriented towards benefiting man. You never use man to accomplish some other goal, some other end. This bothered utilitarians. And for those of you who are familiar with John Stuart Mill, that was the name that I was thinking of, but I didn't necessarily include it here. But this bothered utilitarians who believed in what we know as the greatest good for the greatest number as the most rational way to go. The few become legitimately expendable to the benefit of the many. Utilitarians believe that it is perfectly legitimate because it's rational, makes common sense, to sacrifice the best interests of a few when the result will be the public or the common interest for the many. So in that sense, using man as a means is legitimate when it benefits the masses. That's what the utilitarians argue. And of course that runs contrary to what Immanuel Kant said as his categorical imperative. In today's complex world, where institutions have become too big to fail, we witness the disturbing transition of quite principled means into self-serving ends. Colleges, businesses, public service agencies, human care facilities, even governments themselves, each created to serve the public interest, seem too often inclined to adopt self-preservation as an institutional priority. I'd like to stop for a moment and address that last issue, because I think that is incredibly significant. It's something that all of us, it seems to me, have experienced in one way or another. I know we've done this before, but think back to the origins of the Catholic Church following the fall of Rome. The creation of the Pope and the appointment by Jesus of Peter as the first Pope. The purpose of the Catholic Church was to save souls. According to the Church, God so loved mankind that while original sin existed, God, in His love for man, created the Church because the Church would give man the kind of guidance man needed in order to be saved. Through special graces, through the sacraments, and through other special teachings, the Church would fulfill God's commitment to help man in his quest for salvation. What that means is that from the very beginning, the Church was a means to an end, which was salvation. But over time, what happened? Over time, the Church seemed to be transformed from the means to an end into an end in itself. Think of the Crusades. More recently, think of the child abuse scandals worldwide in the Catholic Church. More specifically, consider the efforts of the Church to defend the Church from the lawsuits of those who were abused, even if the Church ended up shielding perpetrators of the abuse, shielding priests and bishops who participated in or looked the other way in the face of what they knew to be abuse. The church was putting its survival, its reputation, its stability, and its security ahead of the children who were abused. It seems to me that in the context of this debate between means and ends, the church clearly had begun to see itself as an end in itself, to the point that it had almost abandoned its commitment to save souls. Many of you will be familiar of the story of the Catholic Church in Europe during the reign of Adolf Hitler, prior to World War II. And will recognize that under the Pope, Pope Pius XII, the church, in many cases, seemed to be duplicitous, seemed to be in cohorts, in union with Hitler. Or at least the church did not take up positions of opposition against Hitler. The rationale being that the Pope's principal responsibility had to be to protect the church against Nazism, which literally had the power to destroy the church in Europe. So preservation of the church in the face of the Nazi threat seemed to drive the behavior of the Pope and the church prior to and during World War II, to the point that many people, many governments, and many churches were willing to look the other way while the Holocaust was happening. That's an example, it seems to me, of the transition from an institution that was created as a means to perform noble ends, a transition into an institution that seemed to see itself as an end in itself. That's not the only example, because it seems to me, by definition, institutions tend always in this direction. Think of colleges and universities. The purposes of colleges and universities, in the first place, is to serve students, is to educate students, is to promote the public interest or the general welfare, is to participate in the producing the kind of educated workforce which is going to play a direct role in economic development. Indeed, and this has been in the news over the last week, a major force in higher education in America has long been the University of Wisconsin. The University of Wisconsin is one of the so-called land-grant institutions that was created after the Civil War as part of the Morrill Land Grant Act, the Morrill Act. And the University of Wisconsin, when it was created, adopted a mission of service to the citizens of the state of Wisconsin. And they even adopted the term to identify this mission. They called it the Wisconsin Idea. The Wisconsin Idea was to turn the university and all of its resources into promoting the public interest of the citizens of the state of Wisconsin by training its people, training its leaders, and committing itself to the full participation toward economic development in the state of Wisconsin. And as we entered the 20th century, this Wisconsin idea became the driving force for the so-called progressive era in American history, when government, under the leadership of progressives like Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, and Theodore Roosevelt, the Republican, that progressivism required that government tap into its institutions of higher education, the universities, the colleges, in order to bring the expertise that existed there to the service of government, so that government could enact policies and programs which would benefit citizens, benefit economic growth, promote job growth, promote economic development, and educate the citizenry into the best educated workforce in the world. That was the Wisconsin idea. Many of you will know that in his State of the State message delivered at the state capitol in Madison, Wisconsin in January, Scott Walker, the current Republican governor of Wisconsin, made it a point to include in his State of the State message his determination to abandon the Wisconsin idea in order to generate the ingredients of a tax cut for the university system in Wisconsin of $300 million. Scott Walker's argument is that the Wisconsin idea, as it has traditionally been known, is no longer operative and ought not to be any longer operative because the taxpayers of the state of Wisconsin could no longer afford it. And that instead, the university system, not just the main flagship institution in Madison, but all the colleges and universities in the state of Wisconsin had to retool their missions because their primary role in the 21st century was to train workers. And all this research and all this other stuff that was associated with the idea of the Wisconsin idea was to be abandoned because it was too expensive and the taxpayers could no longer afford it. And you probably know that the reaction to that within the state of Wisconsin was immediate and loud, to the point that Governor Walker backed off and apologized. Not exactly apologized. Said that his mention of the abandonment of the Wisconsin idea had been an error in the way he interpreted or the way he read the text of his speech, that he didn't mean to say that. And at least for the present, the idea of the Wisconsin idea has been preserved. The Wisconsin idea being a classic example of an institution committing itself, its people, and its resources as a means towards service to the citizens of the state which supported it with their tax revenue. But let's face it, in its efforts to raise money, and I happen to know because I'm an alumnus, in its money-raising efforts, in the promotion of funds and gifts for its foundation, the implication has been that the university and those who love it, and I include myself in that group, need to contribute to and support the university for its own sake. In other words, most often in the literature that I've seen, the Wisconsin idea is not usually mentioned in the fundraising efforts of the university. I've seen that in other universities and colleges I've been connected to as well. Graduates, alumni, are encouraged to leave permanent gifts in their wills and to make contributions to the foundations in order to establish strong, healthy endowments which will enable the institution to go on no matter what happens to the economy and the rest of it. In other words, the implication is that the institution has become an end in itself, and that the number one goal for all of us ought to be the preservation and security of the institution, forgetting oftentimes why that institution was created in the first place. Here in southern West Virginia, for example, which is one of the poorest states in the Union, let me be more specific. Southern West Virginia is one of the poorest regions in the poorest state in the Union. In its wisdom, the West Virginia legislature created colleges and located them in the southern part of the state with the idea that colleges in this region would perform the same kind of mission here as the Wisconsin idea was intended to perform for the citizens of the state of Wisconsin. And so, as a result, in 1872, Concord College was located in Athens, West Virginia. And a few years later, 14 miles away, Bluefield State College was created. Of course, the reality is that at the time, Bluefield State was considered to be the black college, while Concord remained the white college. So the fact that we have two colleges located so close together is primarily a product of the racial realities of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But that's another issue. The fact of the matter is, there were two tax-supported public colleges in the southern part of the state because the West Virginia legislature believed that this part of the state needed the kind of economic impetus. The citizens of the southern part of the state needed the kind of educational services that these institutions would provide to the region. But lo and behold, here we are 150 years later, almost, 143, 144 years later, and this region remains among the poorest regions in the poorest state in the Union. None of the Wisconsin idea-like outcomes have happened in southern West Virginia. In fact, I have made the point that if you drive 3 miles from the main campus of Concord or Bluefield State, you would not know that there was a major college or university anywhere in the region. Because these institutions, for whatever reason, have not really made the purpose for which they were created. Instead, it appears they have largely become ends in themselves. Alumni and givers generally are asked to support their athletic programs, to support the reality, which is a plus, that many students who have gone to these institutions and graduated are the first in their families to ever attend and successfully graduate from college. That's part of it. But unfortunately, the mission goes beyond that. But what these institutions have largely become is selective, chosen, bypass, or look services to local people in their quest for incoming students who demonstrate the kind of academic abilities which will enhance the reputations of the institution. That's important. That's important. But it's not all that these institutions are about. These are public institutions supported by taxpayers of West Virginia. And by definition, that means that they are presumed to be performing a function for the state and its citizens, not just serving the institution itself. Those of you who are familiar, who have some background in psychology, may be familiar with a book done some years ago by a sociologist named Erving Goffman, entitled Asylums. Goffman studied asylums, institutions for the mentally ill. And he pointed out that many of these institutions who are created to serve sick people end up becoming self-serving institutions in their own right. They develop their own internal pattern of operation, and oftentimes the key objective in the operation of these institutions is keeping the patients in line, whether in fact it benefits the mental health of the patients or not. I'm trying to remember the name of the very famous movie. About the institution, and I'm drawing a blank here on the movie. But anyway, you kind of know what I mean. Business is the same way. Public servants agencies the same way. Agencies created to deliver services to people become more and more agencies whose primary objective is to raise funds in order to continue to employ and be able to add to the number of employees. And the institutions almost become self-serving. Self-preservation and institutional growth seem to become objectives in themselves. Basically, what I'm suggesting here, going back to the theme of this presentation, how do teachers teach the Annapolis Convention, especially when they know about the auto letter and they know that what's in the textbook about the Annapolis Convention is not quite the whole story? So in a sense, what we've looked at is the issue of ends and means. And here's the final paragraph of this particular piece. All well and good, you say. But the founders? When moral and ethical crises emerged, they seemed always to be on the right side. Never once a doubt as to who cut down that cherry tree. Paragons of virtue to most, visionaries to all. Some see the founders as demigods, inspired by their Creator to establish what they know for certain, evidence to the contrary notwithstanding, is a Christian nation. Now all this information about the behavior of the founders as it relates to the Annapolis Convention. What do teachers do? Men who truly believed that the future of the nation was in jeopardy might be excused for the means they employed to preserve it. Did what the founders did, Hamilton and Madison and Tench Coxe and John Dickinson and the rest of them, did what they did in order to delay the arrival of delegates to the convention, in order to make it impossible for the convention to do business, thereby making it possible to issue the call for a full-fledged convention the next year to revise the Articles of Confederation and meet all the areas of concern about the Union. Did that end justify what they did to the Annapolis Convention? I'm not saying it did, but I'm not saying it didn't either. Here's the final thought. Why not let students decide? Why not give them the evidence? And why not make the focus of discussion the behavior of the leadership in the context of the political realities of the day? Was the nation in danger of going under? Was it likely or even possible that the benefits of independence would be lost? Is there enough evidence to support the idea that the founders were genuinely so concerned about the future of the nation that they believed that whatever they needed to do under these circumstances was justified? Some students are going to go along with that. Other students are going to stand up and say it doesn't matter what the issues were. If what they did was wrong, they shouldn't have done it. But the fact of the matter is, irrespective of which side of that particular debate each student ends up on, we are going to produce students who know the issues. We're going to produce students who understand the situation. We're going to produce students who know the founders. We're going to produce students who know their history, which is quite different than what our schools are producing now. In this kind of situation, the teacher organizes the kind of educational experience which will give all students the opportunity to learn. Not just a few, but all students. Because all students can participate in this discussion. You don't have to be, have a 140 IQ in order to understand the issue of ends and means. Once it's clarified, once it's explained to you. All kids can understand that. Why not give them an opportunity to weigh in and begin to look at history in a context like this? Learn some history, experience some success in school, and once they participate in the discussion of issues like this, they will never forget. They may forget the details, They may forget the dates. They may forget the names of the individuals involved. But they're never going to forget the principle that is really the focus. If we could begin to initiate the kinds of changes in our schools which would produce these kinds of learning situations in our schools, it seems to me we would solve a lot more problems to create. But that requires a commitment from people who, up to this point, have not indicated that they are willing to make that commitment. Here in the state of West Virginia, here, it's American history way, as it were, before they were allowed to deal with things like global economics, global trade, international affairs, communism, socialism, anything else. Anything that might create a problem is to be banned from our learning institutions until after students have had at least a year and a half of grounding. That, to me, indicates that we're dealing with a lot of minds, a lot of individuals who are not willing or have not yet made the commitment, made the decision that we need to go in a different direction in order to improve the educational quality for all of our young people. It's very obvious from the Otto letter that those who were orchestrating the Annapolis Convention, in fact, they orchestrated the failure of the Annapolis Convention, did not really betray much faith in the ability of the citizens to understand the whole situation. Consequently, they felt that they had to put forth this facade, this charade, that the real issue was commerce, when they knew it wasn't. We're talking about the decision to give all young people, not just a few, an opportunity to get in and participate actively in some of these learning experiences. When that commitment is made, the problem will begin to be solved. Until then, I'm afraid it will not. We've reached the top of our first hour. In fact, we've gone a couple of minutes beyond it. I'd like to pause for a 5-minute break and then come back in our second hour and take up another issue that is with us in this day and age in a big way, especially here in West Virginia, but I think all states and all listeners will be more than interested in this, and this is the very well-known issue of right to work. So I'd like to come back and address that issue and spend a little bit of time dealing with it as it applies to the mission here of the Virtual Center. I want to thank you for joining us. I want to invite you to stay with us. We'll be right back after a 5-minute break. This is Bill O'Brien for the Virtual Center and for the study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Thanking you. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the second hour of our program here on this Monday, the 9th of February in the year 2015. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I want to, first of all, thank those of you who've been with us since the beginning of our program an hour ago and are still with us after our 5-minute break. But I also want to welcome those of you who may be just joining us for our second hour and perhaps were not available for the first hour of today's program at the Virtual Center. I want to welcome all of you to the Virtual Center. I want to thank you for your continued support, not only of this program, but also for the Head On Radio Network and the people that make it possible. And I mentioned at the outset, and I'd like to mention again, that anything that any of us can do to support the Head On Radio Network and its efforts to keep a progressive voice out there in today's debate is not only appreciated, but is absolutely vital. I think by the time we get through the second hour and this looking at this issue of right to work, I think we're going to realize that this is one of the areas where it's absolutely essential that an alternative voice be heard. Because at this point, one voice is seeking to overwhelm all of those who would raise questions. And I actually want to address that issue as part of our presentation today. Also, I'd like to announce, as I did at the beginning of our first hour, that after this program today, for the next 5 programs, tomorrow and Wednesday this week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday next week, Bob Kincaid and his folks at the Head On Radio Network will be playing previous programs from the archives of the Virtual Center. I'll be driving to Florida. It's going to be a 2-day trip there and back. I'll be spending 4 or 5 days with a real good friend, a friend that has been a fellow that has been a friend of mine for close to 50 years. In fact, he married my first wife and me in 1973. He was a licensed preacher and married us. So we've been friends ever since the early 70s. And he's having some health issues, and I feel the need to go down there. So for the next 5 programs, we'll be doing repeat programs, which will basically mean, I know that many of you listen to our programs on repeat broadcasts through the archives anyway. So for you, this will not be an inconvenience. But for those who do tune in live each day, I think it's important to recognize for the next week and a half, if you do choose to call in, you will not be able to do it. But you are able to call in today, and we have a phone number, and I would welcome your comments on the issue we just completed, which was the Annapolis Convention and the educational context within which I hope I was able to present it in a way which made some sense. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N. If you'd like to communicate with me via email, I would love to hear from you. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. W-A-O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N, all one word, 906@gmail.com. I'd like to shift gears in this our second hour, as I announced at the end of our just before we took our break, that I'd like to address the issue in this particular portion of our program of right to work. It's a very controversial issue. It's hot here in West Virginia right now because the new Republican legislature has introduced right to work legislation in order to make West Virginia a right to work state, as is North Carolina and Virginia and many of the other states, Ohio and many of the other states surrounding the state of West Virginia. There's no question that there's a lot of misinformation, or in some cases lack of information, about this particular issue, about many issues. We know that. But this particular one is significant because the very term itself, right to work, seems to suggest that it's very positive legislation because it's going to guarantee everybody the right to get a job. To be very honest with you, that's, for the most part, what those actively involved in this right to work legislation here in West Virginia want people to believe. The fact of the matter is, right to work has a history. And a look at that history is going to cause people to take a second look at the whole issue of right to work. And that's what we're about. I'm not trying to tell people how to vote or what they should believe and what's true and what's not true. I don't want this program to be that kind of a program. I want this program to be the kind of program that gives people the information they need in order to make wise, intelligent decisions, rather to browbeat a particular opinion or a particular interpretation or ideology. I think we have enough programs out there that do that. This is an aside. I probably ought not to mention this, but it just seems to occur to me at the moment. Early this morning, I spent about 5 minutes, and I mean that, that's probably more than I usually spend, on Fox Network. And the reason I did is because the issue announced at the break, before a commercial break, the announcement was that when the network returned from its commercial break, they were going to be dealing with President Obama's reaction at the prayer breakfast last week on the issue of ISIS and on the issue of fundamentalism in religion. I felt that this is something I ought to pay attention to. The guest for this segment was going to be Mike Huckabee. It was, everybody knows, is probably going to be a candidate once again for the Republican nomination for president. Mike Huckabee, who is the author of a book that just came out. In fact, an op-ed piece in the New York Times over the weekend made the point, Gail Collins made the point in her piece, that it's books like this one by Mike Huckabee that one of the things we do is reread them so you won't have to. But be that as it may, Mike Huckabee was to be the guest. And, of course, I realized that what he was going to do was be to tear into President Obama and the comments he made about the whole issue of the religions of the world in the face of the brutality being committed in the Middle East of late. And what President Obama did, as many of you will know, is he asked people to not forget that Christians were guilty of the same kind of horrendous behavior during the Crusades. And so I think most of us can anticipate where Mike Huckabee was going to go with his retaliatory comments. That's not my point right here, though. My point was that during the interview with Mike Huckabee, the person on Fox who was interviewing him said more about the issue than Mike Huckabee did. In fact, Mike Huckabee had some difficulty in getting a word in because the questioner, she was one of the friends in Friends and Fox, I don't even know her name, but was so adamant and so critical of President Obama that all she left for Mike Huckabee to say was amen. And what I began to realize is, my God, she's the one that's asking the questions. She's not supposed to be loading the deck, so to speak, with lead-in questions and comments like this. That's what I mean by the fact that there are people out there who are so intent on getting their point of view across that they will literally browbeat us into particular positions on some key issues. Right to work is one of those. And right to work has a history. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time today on that issue. But first, I'd like to make the point, how does this issue fit into the overall mission of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility? The answer to that question, it seems to me, is linked to the idea that a century ago, almost, in this nation, working people were given the right to have a voice, a meaningful voice in the conditions on which they worked. right to work would take away that voice. It seems to me then that this issue becomes of rights. It becomes an issue of civic responsibility. Also, since the issue of right to work becomes involved in the issue of federalism in terms of whether working conditions under which American citizens work should be defined and protected, and are defined and protected at the national level by Congress. And in the face of that, state right-to-work laws can be viewed as potentially, although the courts haven't ruled on this yet, as unconstitutional. Because by definition, right to work infringes on areas that our courts have said are national areas, are areas where Congress has the priority to act and not states. There is the potential that right-to-work legislation could be considered and interpreted as unconstitutional, at least in part. My point is, I can't resolve that now. I don't think any of us can. But my point is the fact that that question is on the table, the fact that the role of the federal government in defining and protecting the working conditions under which American citizens can and should work and have their security and their safety protected are matters directly related to the mission of the Virtual Center. Consequently, this becomes an issue that is indeed within the framework of what the Virtual Center is all about. I think that legitimacy is important because I don't want anyone to get the sense that I'm just going off on tangents and dealing with issues that are sometimes related to the mission of the program, but at other times are not. So with that, let's do what we can in the next 45 minutes or so, 40 minutes, to look at the issue of right to work. The issue itself, I don't want to make this a West Virginia specific story, but in one sense it is because it's happening right here in West Virginia now. It's happened in other states before. It's happening in this state now. In this morning's local paper here in southern West Virginia, the Beckley Register-Herald, today's editorial focuses on the issue of right to work. This is what a readership of approximately, I believe the number is 72,000 subscribers to the Register-Herald. So we know that we know that this is the major paper in the southern part of the state, at least. This is the one that everybody reads. So let me share with you its editorial on right to work this morning. The title of the article, of the editorial, is Who's Affected? And the subtitle, Weigh All Aspects of Becoming Right to Work State. In other words, the message here is asking citizens to weigh all the issues associated with right to work before they make up their minds. I think the question, of course, is whether in fact we are dealing with a legislative majority in this state who have already made up their minds whether they've weighed all aspects of the issue or not. But that's another issue. The editorial makes the point that everybody wants jobs and prosperity in West Virginia. It's a universal goal. Everybody wants that. For that purpose, the legislature's new majority wants to make West Virginia a right-to-work state. That's their rationale. Its supporters claim that more businesses will be attracted to West Virginia if, quote, a small limitation, unquote, is placed on labor unions. This topic should be studied thoroughly. Nobody, it seems to me, can object to the call for studying the subject thoroughly. But I would suggest to you that the suggestion that right to work is only a small limitation on labor unions is an editorial opinion which is contradictory to the overall call for study. What I'm suggesting is the slant and the tone of this particular editorial. This is not a call for citizens to study and be fair. This is a call for citizens to make a decision, a particular decision on this issue. In a sense, then, it puts the editorial policy of this newspaper directly behind the proposed legislation, even though the editorial is written as if that was not true. To go on, the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act, and I did mention that there's a history in this country to right to work, and a lot of it revolves around Taft-Hartley. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, which Congress passed over President Truman's veto, bans closed shops or union shops in which only union members may work. Closed shops or union shops were part of the New Deal legislation of the 1930s under President Roosevelt. It gave unions the right to organize, to collective bargain, and to strike. And it also endorsed the right of unions to demand that everybody needed to be a member of the union in order to work there. The idea being that if the union is going to be strong and able to bargain effectively, it needs to be able to represent all the people working in that particular workplace, not just some of them. So this editorial makes the point that Taft-Hartley banned closed shops or union shops, but it approves what the editorial calls agency shops. These let some workers refuse to join unions, but they must pay fees for representation by union agents. Then the point is made in parentheses that the federal government does not allow agency shops for U.S. government employees, even though Taft-Hartley, even though it banned closed shops, did give unions the right to continue to function and did require that even if somebody who worked there chose to not become a member of the union, they had to pay a fee in order to help the union represent them. Because in effect they were being represented by the unions, and the legislation suggested that if they're going to be represented by the unions, they needed to be expected to pay for that representation. And that's part of the legislation. That's a fact. But the newspapers mention that the federal government does not allow federal employees to have to pay these fees is part of the newspaper's overall position on this particular issue. Then the newspaper in the editorial goes on to say the following, and this is the part that I wanted to really emphasize. Actually, the editorial says, this issue involves only a tiny fringe of workers because organized labor has disintegrated in America. Unquote. Actually, this issue involves only a tiny fringe of workers because organized labor has disintegrated in America. On the surface, that seems to make sense. Why not pass legislation if it only affects a very small fringe, tiny fringe, of people? Of course, the issue here is why is the paper able to report that organized labor has disintegrated in America? And the answer is because of legislation like Right to Work. Because of editorial positions like this very newspaper is taking. And then the editorial goes on to include some data on the decline of unions in America. Only 6.6% of America's private sector workers now belong to unions, the lowest rate since 1932. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reported on January 23rd. So within the last 2 weeks, the Labor Department has reported that union membership in private sector, not government sector, private sector workers is 6.6% in unions. This means, the newspaper says, that 93.4% of American job holders aren't unionized. That, of course, is the result of the anti-union campaign that continues to be underway, because you can include this editorial in that campaign. West Virginia's state government has about 40,000 workers, but only around 500 of them belong to the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees Union, and just 1,100 belong to the new West Virginia Public Workers Union. So what the newspaper is saying is, of the 40,000 state workers in the state of West Virginia, less than 2,000, 1,600 of 40,000 are members of organized unions. Government employees, the editorial says, generally have freedom to decide whether to join unions or whether to abstain and avoid paying dues. A right-to-work law wouldn't affect most of them. So in other words, the goal here of the editorial is to point out that the right-to-work legislation that is currently being considered in the state legislature here in West Virginia would only affect a tiny fringe of working people. And then the editorial goes on to say that stormy emotions roused by the battle in the legislature are going on. But calm folks should remember The tempest affects just a few, not even the 6.6% who belong to unions, but only the subgroup whose unions get fees from non-joiners. The goal here is to suggest that right to work in West Virginia is really insignificant. But in effect, it's important because it's part of yet one additional state potentially becoming a right-to-work state. So let's look at some of this history of right-to-work. Not only did the Beckley newspaper here in West Virginia make right-to-work a focus in today's newspapers, but so also did the statewide newspaper, the Charleston Gazette. And in this morning's Charleston Gazette, there is a detailed article on right to work written by John David, who John David was a faculty member at West Virginia Tech until he retired a few years ago. And for a number of years, John David has been director of the Southern Appalachian Labor School. So this is labor's position on right to work. We've heard the newspaper's position, the editorial position, that it's only going to affect a tiny fringe of people, since unions are all but dead anyway, so why worry about it? I think what we're going to see in this piece is a little bit more information on right to work. John David tells us that the question of right to work in West Virginia has come up a number of times before, but it's always been rejected by a Democratic legislature in West Virginia, but now we have a Republican-controlled legislature. Right to work in West Virginia has been rejected in the past for 4 reasons. And here are those 4 reasons. 1, it does not mean that every worker has the right to a job and to receive work at fair wages, reasonable hours, and under decent labor standards or conditions. Right to work doesn't mean that at all, even though on the surface it seems to mean that, but it doesn't. Number 2, another reason that right to work has been rejected in the past. It does not mean that every worker has a right to secure employment with proper provisions for paid vacations and insurance safeguards against sickness and old age. Things that are very, very important to working people. Right to work doesn't involve any of that either. Number 3, right to work does not mean that every worker is protected against arbitrary discharge. The implication would seem to be that if there's a right to work law, that means that workers can't be fired for insignificant reasons, but it doesn't mean that at all. And number 4, it doesn't mean to strengthen the individual worker's bargaining position through a union of choice. Right to work would seem to mean that workers' rights, if they wanted to become a union, they ought to be able to do it. That's not part of this either. So what in the heaven's name is right to work if it's none of those things? John David tells us right to work historically began in the 1930s and 40s in the South. And it was part of the campaign of a segregated South. No question, Right to work was the position adopted by segregated southern states before World War II that was principally responsible for so many businesses moving from New England and the Midwest into the South in order to get rid of the unions that they felt that they were currently forced to deal with. Right to work, by definition, was a strategy used by the segregated South in order to attract union businesses from other parts of the country. Right to work made it possible to relocate to the South and not have to pay union wages, not have to negotiate with unions, not have to treat people with respect. Right to work, more than, as much as, maybe more than anything else, is the reason that the economies in the South started to do so well as the economies in the Northeast and Midwest, in the areas of manufacturing, began to decline because they began to lose jobs. Now we know, of course, that since World War II, many of the jobs that relocated to the South are now relocating overseas. And so many of these good jobs in the South that didn't require unions have now left the South as well. And now working people everywhere are in trouble. John David tells us that according to the Institute of Southern Studies, Vance Muse, M-U-S-E, founded the Christian American Association in 1936 with support from Southern oil companies and Northern industrialists. The Christian American Association was the first organization in the nation to champion right to work. That was the beginning of the campaign to lure businesses into the segregated South. One of the Northern industrialists who became very active in his support of the Christian American Association of 1936 was Fred Koch, who founded the John Birch Society and, of course, is the father of the Koch brothers, who are currently funneling funds into our national political campaigns, in large part as a result of the Citizens United decision in 2010. Their father was a major backer of the organization that introduced the concept of right to work. And then John Davis tells us what right to work includes. You remember he opened by telling us what it wasn't. Now he tells us what it was. And he points out that right to work laws are, he believes, a violation of the letter and spirit of the Constitution of the United States, which delegated to the federal government the power to regulate commerce. If the Constitution of the United States gave control over commerce to Congress, which it did, then for states to pass legislation which interferes with the flow of commerce between states becomes unconstitutional. if it doesn't violate the letter of the Constitution, it violates the spirit of the Constitution. In fact, let me go back to our first hour today with a reminder that the Annapolis Convention of 1786 was ostensibly called in order for Congress to ultimately have control over commerce. The Articles of Confederation, the Congress, the Annapolis Convention, was called so that the states could independently, without the central government, fix the problems related to commerce. But Hamilton and Madison sabotaged that convention in order to make sure that commerce, along with the other major issues, became part of the Constitution of the United States. In other words, Congress would get the power to regulate commerce. Hamilton and Madison wanted that. That's why they didn't want the Annapolis Convention to be successful. Now states are passing right-to-work laws which interfere with that power, that congressional power. If it's not unconstitutional legally, it sure as heck violates the spirit of the Constitution. And John David says that. He also points out that the Wagner Act and the U.S. Supreme Court have consistently ruled that states may not adopt their own codes of labor relations. The regulation of labor conditions for working people in this country was to come from the federal level, not the state level. In 1947, of course, the Taft-Hartley Act was passed, which was an effort to undo some of the pro-labor legislation of Roosevelt's New Deal. President Truman, of course, is a Democrat, he vetoed it, but Congress was able to pass it over the president's veto. Why the anti-union feeling in the 1940s when there was so much pro-union feeling in the 1930s? There's no question that a lot of it has to do with the behavior of labor during and after, especially after World War II. If you remember, the federal government during the war, during World War II, controlled labor relations to the point that unions were not allowed to strike. But unions were encouraged to believe that once the war was over and once the emergency was passed, that unions would regain the right to sit down with employers and pass legislation improving work conditions, raising salaries, and all the rest of it. Because pay was frozen during the war. Working people were not allowed to strike during the war for increases in pay or anything else. After the war, then, labor began to undertake a number of strikes in pursuit of higher pay and all the rest of it. And it's in response to those strikes that Congress feels like maybe we went too far during the New Deal and supported Taft-Hartley, which takes away the union's right to the closed shop. In other words, the union's right to demand that everybody working in a particular place be a union member. But as the editorial in the newspaper told us, it didn't totally abolish labor's right to organize. It didn't totally abolish labor's right, working people's right to be represented by unions. It just gave workers some choice as to whether they belonged to the union or whether they didn't. But even if they didn't, they were expected to contribute to their own representation. Because unions, even though some people chose not to belong, unions still had to negotiate for pay increases that everybody got, not just the union. So in a sense, unions were representing non-members. And it stands to reason that unions would expect that they be compensated for that. So that's the controversy surrounding Taft-Hartley. And according to Section 14B of Taft-Hartley, excuse me, that's the one section that Congress insisted not be changed. Because Section 14B made labor relations allowed labor relations to continue to be a national issue, not a state issue. When right-to-work legislation began to pass in state after state, it violated the provisions of Section 14B of Taft-Hartley. Because right-to-work made it impossible for unions to collect fees even from non-union members that they represented. In other words, right-to-work legislation contradicted or rejected elements of the Taft-Hartley Act. So there was a contradiction or a violation in existence as a result of right-to-work legislation. And of course, this is the point. John David makes this point. If a worker who is represented by a union and doesn't pay dues is fired illegally, the union must use its time and its money to defend him or her, even if that requires going through a costly, time-consuming legal process. Since the union represents everyone, everyone benefits. So everyone should share in the costs of providing these services. The same is true for negotiated wages, hours, and working conditions, which must apply to both those who voted for and against union representation. Non-members who are represented by a union can even sue the union if they think it has not represented them fairly. So, in a sense, as a result of right-to-work, unions began to disintegrate, because if unions had to represent people who were not members, why should members pay dues to unions? So consequently, more and more unions began to lose members. Because what we had was a situation where the members were paying dues to represent everybody, but everybody wasn't supporting the representation. And that's what right-to-work does. Bottom line, right-to-work from the very beginning was a strategy to destroy unions. It was not a strategy to get people to work. It was not a strategy to guarantee people the right to a job. It was a strategy designed by business to break unions. That's what it's about. That's what it's always been about. And that's what it's about here. And for our local newspaper, in an editorial to say, nothing wrong with passing it, it only affects a tiny fringe of working people because, it doesn't say this, but because we effectively have killed unions anyway. They're all but dead anyway. Why worry about this last little piece of legislation is what the newspaper is saying. I think that that's despicable. personally. Anyway, there's one more issue. We have 3 minutes to go in our program. And this relates to the issue of civil rights. More specifically, to the name Martin Luther King. We all know that February is Black History Month. We also know that we just in January celebrated the birthday of Martin Luther King. What did Martin Luther King say about right to work? John David includes this quote from Martin Luther King. Quote, "In our glorious fight for civil rights, we must guard against being fooled by false slogans, such as right to work. It is a law to rob us of our civil rights and job rights. Its purpose is to destroy labor unions of collective bargaining, by which unions have improved wages and working conditions of everyone. For these laws, job opportunities are fewer, and there are no civil rights." Unquote. Dr. Martin Luther King. I don't think there's a statement that says it any more clearly than that. The purpose of right to work is to kill unions. Martin Luther King's point is that in killing unions, in killing working people's right to organize and bargain collectively, you are denying working people their civil rights. That's how important this issue is. I don't care if it only affects one working person in the state of West Virginia. Back to our issue of ends and means. If the ends are legitimate, said the Supreme Court in McCulloch versus Maryland, the means to acquire those ends become legitimate as well. In this nation, we have decided that civil rights is a worthy end. Therefore, we have an obligation to oppose anything that infringes on civil rights, and right to work does. So says Dr. Martin Luther King. So also say I. We are at 58 minutes after the hour. Rick Smith is getting ready to begin his program in 2 minutes. So let me close by thanking all of you who have listened to the program today, to the Virtual Center. But more important, let me remind you that beginning tomorrow, our programs will be pre-recorded for the next 2 weeks through next Wednesday. That means that it'll be 2 weeks from today before we get back together live here at the Virtual Center. I encourage you to avail yourself of the opportunities to listen to the previously recorded programs and to jot down issues that you feel you would like to call in on when